Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Training Accreditation Council's webinar on trainer and assessor requirements. My name's Karina Musto and I'm one of the team members at the Training Accreditation Council. We'd like to take a moment now to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land we're meeting on, the Whadjuk people. We wish to acknowledge and respect their continuing culture and the contribution they make to the life of this city and this region. Now, I would like to introduce Claire Werner, who is our facilitator.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here. We have many people with us today from all over Australia. Good morning to you all. For some of you, it'll already be afternoon. So today our session is looking at the trainer assessor requirements that sit within the standards for RTOs, and to also have the opportunity to have a look at the early changes that have been made to those standards. And so you would have received some handouts in the post that TAC put up earlier in the chat session. There's a link to those handouts, and we certainly will be using those handouts throughout the session, so please make sure that you have them. You should have a copy of this PowerPoint, and you should have some fact sheets from TAC, the trainer assessor regulatory requirements, and the TAC fact sheet on vocational competence and industry currency. So this is a workshop that we have just tweaked for the early changes, and we're very open to having any feedback that you might have about our workshop. So the contact details for TAC are on the last slide of this workshop, so please feel free to use that to provide any feedback. So before we really get into things, I want to stress that this workshop has been put together for RTOs who are registered with TAC. There will be many of you with us here today who are registered with ASQA or the VRQA. So we would recommend that you also look at the advice that has been provided by that regulator. With so many people here today, I also want to let you know that we have got people from TAC here who are going to monitor the chat box. So if you're putting questions in the chat box, it's possible that I would answer them. It's also possible that Mel or Karina from TAC might answer them. So we have got some objectives that we're aiming to address today, and that is really to have a look at the qualifications that are required to be a trainer and assessor in the vet sector in Australia. We're going to talk about vocational competence and industry currency. We will look at the RTO's responsibilities when they have a third-party arrangement in place, and training and assessment is part of that arrangement. And we would also look to see what auditors expect in terms of compliance when you might be demonstrating compliance for these clauses. So we have 60 minutes together today. So we should be finishing at about 11 o'clock, and hopefully we'll answer all of your questions. So in our standards, we have a number of clauses that are focused on the trainers and assessors. And the reason for that is that effective trainers and assessors are really critical to making sure that we have high quality vocational education and training. So there are 4 clauses that really focus on the trainer assessor. 113, that one is about vocational competence and industry currency. 114 and 115, they are about the training and assessment qualifications that you need to have to be a trainer assessor in our sector. And 116 is about the professional development that you would undertake as a trainer and assessor. So the requirements of these clauses have been in place for many years, but it's really useful for us to come back and have a look at them again in light of the changes that have occurred. Today, we're really going to focus on 113, 114, 115. We're going to spend quite a bit of time there. And we'll also talk a little bit about 117 and 118. They're the clauses that are around supervision. But the TAC fact sheet that is in place has got a whole lot more detail around all of these clauses. So please refer to that if you would like some more information. We're going to start by focusing on clause 114 and 115. And that is because this is the area of the standards where there have been some changes that have been made. So in August of last year, which seems like a very long time ago at the moment, the skills ministers, so that's all the state and territory and the federal skills ministers, agreed that they were going to make some changes to the standards for registered training organisations, and they called them the early changes to the standards. So these came into effect on the 1st of March this year, and the changes were aiming to do a few things, and they're the things that we've got listed on the slide there. Really, the aim was to reduce pressure on the vet sector workforce by expanding that workforce pool. And that is about making sure that we have got some more flexibility about who can come in and work in our sector as a trainer and assessor, to look at some very clear parameters around how that is to work, to provide some clarity around some of the definitions that are in place. So things like industry expert, and making sure that they do actually have the relevant competency skills to work in our sector, provide clarity for those people who hold education degrees and can be engaged in the vet sector, and really to ensure consistency in requirements on skill sets around delivery and validation. So in those early changes, what you will see is that there was very broad support when that was taken to the sector for consultation, and those things are now in place. So we're going to dig into those things. Okay, so first we start with clause 114. And so this is the clause that focuses on the qualifications that you need to be a trainer and assessor in our sector. So it's really important to understand that trainers and assessors who already met the requirements of the standards are not required to update their credentials. If you were compliant before the 1st of March, you are compliant after the 1st of March. The credential related changes for this section are in addition, and it's about the different skill sets or the different qualifications that could now also be used. So this clause refers us to Schedule 1 of our standards, and you have actually got that information in the fact sheet that you have in front of you, and that is at the bottom of page 1 and the top of page 2 of that fact sheet. And what that does is it lists all the options that we might have to actually be able to meet the training and assessment requirements. So you're going to see all the familiar things there. Basically, it gives us 5 options. So the first option is you hold the most current TAE qualification, TAE 40122, or its successor, which doesn't exist yet. You hold the 2016 version of that qualification, or you hold the 2010 version of that qualification with those 2 additional units. So that is an LNN unit and another unit which is for designing assessment tools. As we got to the end of the delivery of the TAE 10 qualification, many of the people who did that qualification then had those 2 units included in the qualification as electives. Those of us who did it earlier might have had to hold that qualification and then add 2 extra units to that. So those 4 options have been in our standards. The 4th one is to hold a diploma or a higher level qualification in adult education. We're going to talk quite a lot more about that. But those 4 options have been in our standards. It's option 5 that has been added. And option 5 is about holding a teaching degree, which enables you to work as a secondary school teacher in the vet sector, and one of 2 skill sets. So those 2 skill sets that have to be added to the teaching degree, the secondary teaching degree, is the Assessor skill set, or another skill set called the Vet Delivered to Schools Students Teacher Enhancement skill set, and that's quite a mouthful. So all of that information about what's possible is sitting on page 2 of your handout, which is the fact sheet for trainer assessor requirements. The concept of adding these 2 skill sets to the secondary teaching degree is that it bridges the gap that exists for a secondary school teacher who doesn't know about the vet sector. So it's really about adding that vet knowledge to the teaching knowledge that that person already has. So that has been tested with the regulators and other stakeholders, and providers will ultimately be responsible for ensuring that people delivering training and assessment have current training knowledge and skills in vocational teaching and learning. And of course, that is part of Clause 113 and part of Clause 116. So instead of having 4 options, we now have 5 options for meeting the training and assessment qualification requirement. So let's talk a little more about these secondary teaching qualifications. So if you have a degree to work as a secondary school teacher, then and you undertake one of those 2 skill sets, then you are able to then work in the vocational education and training sector. And the idea of this, of course, which we've already mentioned, is that it facilitates entry into the sector for people who have those degrees. There are a lot of people who work in the vet delivered to secondary school students who already work within our vet sector, and this, it facilitates an easier transfer for these people, maybe out of the school and into an RTO. So when you are looking at this qualification, what these standards say is if you have a secondary teaching qualification, that is a credential that's been issued by a higher education provider. And a higher education provider is actually defined in a piece of legislation. And again, you will see that in the fact sheet there. That you are then able to add these skill sets and work in our sector. So it's really important to remember that not only do you have to have the training and assessment credential, just like anyone else who holds a TAE qualification, you must also show that you're vocationally competent and industry current, and that you participate in professional development. So this change is not saying that's all you need. It's saying it's just another option for that one part of the standards. So while registration as a secondary school teacher isn't mandatory, you must be able to demonstrate that you could meet that requirement. And that requirement doesn't have to be in state that you are going to be working in the vet sector in. So for example, you might meet the requirement in New South Wales for a secondary school teacher, but you are going to work in Western Australia in the vet sector. So the important thing is that you must be able to meet the requirement even if you're not necessarily registered at the moment. So in Western Australia, the Teachers Registration Board is the board that is responsible for registering teachers. And they actually say that a person must hold a teaching qualification from an accredited initial teacher education program, or one that the Training Teachers Registration Board recognises as equivalent to that. Now, they have a list of those, and I'm not sure if it's Mel or Karina that's popping that in, but the link to that has just been popped in the chat box for you. And so you are also going to find that link on page 2 of your fact sheet. Now, they are the qualifications that are recognised here in Western Australia, and of course the rest of Australia also has qualifications that would meet this requirement. And there's a list of those qualifications on the Australian Higher Education Providers website, and you can see the link there is also on page 2 of your fact sheet. So if we're going to be using secondary teaching qualifications, you have to have that qualifications that's recognised off those lists. You must have one of the 2 credentials that is listed there, the TAE Assessor skill set, or the VET Delivered to School Students Teacher Enhancement skill set or its successor. You have to be vocationally competent, and you have to be industry current. And like everybody else, we all have to participate in professional development. So as you can imagine, TAC has been getting a few questions about this, and so we have put some of the most common answers to the questions on this slide. So one of the questions is, do you have to be currently registered? And the answer is no, you don't have to be currently registered. You just have to qualify to be registered. You don't have to meet the academic requirements for secondary teacher registration in the state or territory in which you live. It can be any state or territory within Australia. These changes are focused on Australian qualifications, and so they don't enable individuals who have an overseas teaching qualification to deliver in training and assessment. That was very, very clear in the advice that came from government. And when you're looking at how you might actually be able to evidence that trainers and assessors hold these relevant degrees or eligible degrees, then there are a number of things that you could do. So you could have proof of registration or previous registration as a teacher. You could have a teaching qualification from these accredited initial teacher programs. Or you might actually have a statement of employment from a previous or a current employer demonstrating your employment as a secondary school teacher. You'll notice the advice also says that a curriculum vitae is relevant there. And all of you who know us in Western Australia know that if you're using that a curriculum vitae as any kind of evidence, then you would have to verify that what is said on that curriculum vitae is in fact accurate. So we now have 5 options that sit around there, and I can see that there's been some questions there that Mel and Karina have been answering for you. Let's move on to 1.15. So this is the clause that is for people who actually operate as assessment only. So this clause has always been in place, again, in our sector. And now we have 6 options for how you could meet this requirement if you are a person who only does assessment in our sector. So all the 5 options that we just talked about for the trainer and assessor qualification, they apply also to this clause. And there's a 6th option here, which allows people to operate using the assessor skill set because you are only conducting assessment. So in this one, you could have the assessor skill set or its successor, or you could have an older assessor skill set with one of the units that are around designing and developing assessment tools. And so again, this information is in your fact sheet as to the exact skill sets or the codes of those skill sets. So really, in summary, we have all of the options for meeting the trainer assessment requirements that we already have known and been working with for the past number of years. And then we have added a few more to that. One is to have the secondary teaching qualification and one of the two supporting skill sets, and for people who are conducting assessment to have the assessor skill set. So let's think about what we might need to focus on in an audit situation. So we have a question here for you about what evidence an auditor would be looking for to determine that an RTO is complying with clauses 114 or 115. What we want you to do is to answer that question, and the responses that you put into your question will show on our screen in front of us. Okay, so we've got quite a few responses in there, and you'll see that I'm going to ask Mel or Karina, can you just scroll back up to the top of that a bit for me, please? Okay, so we've got certainly responses in there that are about clauses 114 and 115. And we've got some others that are about the other clauses, 113 in particular. So in here, a lot of you have put down awards or transcripts of qualifications, copies of qualifications. And fundamentally, that is what we are looking for from an audit point of view, verified copies of the trainees and assessors' credentials. So that could be the testament that they have been issued. It could also be the USI transcript if it has been issued in the VAT sector. When it comes to the teachers' qualifications and we're looking at their ability to be registered, then of course we might be looking for some of those other things that we have mentioned, such as the employment records or verified past employment. So with 114 and 115, it's actually quite simple. It is about having that qualification, that testament. Now, I just want to address that a lot of you have also put in there something like a trainer matrix or a TACM, and that is a tool that your organisation is using to record, to basically put all the information in one place about the other stuff that someone is doing. In an audit situation, what we're looking for is actually those copies of the credentials or the USI transcripts. Okay, so now we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about these diploma or higher level qualifications that are one of the fourth option of the five that you have for clause of for both those clauses 114 and 115. And we get asked lots of questions about this, which is why we're focusing on it here. Now, when we're talking about a diploma or a higher level qualification, sometimes those qualifications sit in the VAT sector, sometimes they sit in the higher education sector. These are some examples of higher education qualifications that are around adult education. So there's a number of universities around Australia that offer qualifications, and you can see the titles of those there. We'll just pick a couple of examples from that list that we'll dig into a little bit deeper. So this information, this one comes from the graduate certificate that was on that list. So you can see for this qualification, they have to have 12 credit points to actually achieve the qualification. There's one core unit, And there's 3 elective units there, of which you have to do 2 of those 3 electives. So people coming out of that qualification are going to have quite different skill sets depending upon which electives they chose to do. This is another one. This comes from the bachelor's qualification, and it's a small excerpt of the information around the qualification. So to graduate with this Bachelor in Adult Education, you need 128 credit points. And so as you can imagine, there's a very long list of units that you can choose from, and a range of electives. There are many rules around the range of electives that sit with this qualification. But if we have a look at just the titles of those units, and we look at the 4th one down the list, which is Assessment Practices in Adult and Vocational Education, that one sounds like it would really fit quite well with our sector. So let's have a look at what is in that unit. These are the learning outcomes for the unit. And so what you can see is that maybe what we would expect in terms of training and assessment, or a trainer assessor who comes to us with a TAE qualification, maybe isn't completely aligned with what sits in those learning outcomes. Whenever you are looking at any of these qualifications, then ideally what you will do is investigate. So you'll have a look at the content, but also that you will ask some questions about whether this person really knows what we need them to know for our sector. In your fact sheet for trainer assessor requirements, what you will find on pages 6 and 7 of that fact sheet is there's a table there. And on that table, there's a whole list of things that you should be asking about this qualification to see if it actually aligns well with our sector. So for example, knowledge of adult learning principles, VT and competency-based training and assessment, the Australian VET system. So if you don't know about those things, how would you fill that gap? How would you function effectively in our sector? So we would encourage you to use the questions that are sitting, or the dot points that are sitting in these tables, to help you interrogate any qualification that is offered to you as a diploma or higher level qualification. If nothing else, it will help you think about the kind of development activities that you might put in place for someone who might be missing little bits of what you would want them to know about. So let's think about what we might want for compliance if we are thinking about using one of these diploma or higher level qualifications in adult education as evidence of meeting the requirements of clause 114 or 115. Okay, we're going to talk about some of these things. Could you just pop me back up to the top, please? Right, so we have got in here a few different things. So in the same way that we looked for the verified qualification or the verified transcript when we were looking at the TAE qualifications, we have that same thing here, and a number of you have put that there. I wanted to come back up to the top because there is a really important one that is sitting a second across in the second column, which says investigate the content of the presented qualification and unit of competency. So this is incredibly important. Thanks for highlighting that, because there are so many different qualifications out there that what our regulation does is it says, okay, you can use these RTOs, but you have to verify that this is right. So that investigating the content of the qualification and making sure it does in fact enable someone to work in our sector is really important. And I think this links to a couple of the questions that are sitting in the chat box. So for example, Lindsay, you have popped a question there about the Graduate Diploma of Management Learning. You would need to be looking at that in line with that list of questions that's sitting in pages 6 and 7 of your fact sheet. So it's about you as an RTO making sure that the qualification that's being presented to you is appropriate for use in the vet sector. So when you do that, of course, in an audit situation, what we're doing is we're saying, does the process that you use enable us to be sure of your judgment? So whatever process you have used to decide that the content was relevant for vet is also what we would be looking for, and any actions that you might have taken to address any gaps. Now on this page, I also want to go to the 4th column, the second one down, proof of registration or previous registration as a teacher. Now, this is a completely different option. It doesn't sit in the higher qualification that's about adult education, because your registration as a secondary school teacher is not about adult education, it's about secondary education. So that is a requirement that we now have if you are adding those units, but it's as its own requirement. So it's not something that we would consider within this option. All right, let's keep moving. So clause 117 and 118 in our standards are about what you might need to do when you have someone who is being supervised for training. Now, the TAC fact sheet on page 4 actually has a list of the requirements that would enable you to meet this. Basically, this is when you employ somebody who doesn't yet have all of the requirements to operate solo as a trainer assessor in our sector. These clauses allow you to put supervision arrangements in place for those people. So when someone is being supervised, the list of credentials that they need to hold to enable them to be supervised has expanded significantly. And so if you have a look at page 4, you will actually see that list of credentials there. So this is towards the bottom of the page, and you can see all the different skill sets that actually enable someone to be supervised now. So it's not changing the requirement for supervision, it's just saying more people can be supervised if they hold one of these requirements. So what is one of the things that's different here, other than all of the skill sets, is also your teacher who is working towards those skill sets that they need to have to be able to operate solo is also able to be supervised. Now, that's good news for us because it gives us more scope in terms of how we might manage things. The other thing that has been added, which has always seemed a little strange to us in the vet sector, is if you had enrolled to do your full TAE qualification, you couldn't be supervised unless you held one of those skill sets first. So you might be, halfway through your TAE qualification, but you couldn't be supervised unless you met the requirements for one of those skill sets. That's actually been changed now. So clause 118A actually provides that option that if you are working towards one of those TAE credentials, then you can in fact be be supervised without holding one of those other skill sets. So there's a lot more flexibility in terms of who can be supervised. What's really important to remember, though, is your obligation in terms of supervising those people hasn't changed. So you still have to have something in place to make sure that that person is getting the kind of support and advice that they need to be able to train and assess. And you also have to make sure that that there's a record of those things so that we can see how you're managing that. One of the things that has popped up a lot in terms of questions for these changes is this requirement to be actively working towards. So people are asking, what does actively working towards mean? And that is something that has been defined in the standards, and what it says is that an individual has enrolled in and commenced and is making satisfactory progress towards the qualification. So the question then comes, of course, is what is satisfactory progress? And that would actually need to be determined on an individual basis. So it would involve, for example, if you had a plan to complete that qualification within 12 months or within 2 years, that whatever that plan was, that you were actually meeting the milestones that sat in that plan. So this doesn't, the person who's being supervised, it doesn't mean they don't have to meet those other requirements for being vocationally competent, industry current, and being involved in professional development. So if you are actively working towards these credentials, if you're being supervised, you still have to meet those other requirements that sit there in the standards. We've got other clauses in our regulation, our 120 in particular, which is about the supervision, the supervisor, and you really need to remember that as the supervisor, you're responsible for what that person who you are supervising does in the training and assessment situation. Okay, so lots of changes that sit around clauses 114 and 115, and those clauses are about expanding options rather than adding additional things on top of people who already meet those requirements. Right. So when we are talking about vocational competency, we are talking about clause 113. And so what we will find is that vocational competence for us in the vet sector means that you have this broad industry knowledge and experience that is usually combined with a relevant industry qualification. So a person who has vocational competency is going to be familiar with the content of that vocation and is going to have relevant current experience in the industry. So they have to be considered on an industry by industry basis, and certainly when we look at it on a unit by unit basis. There is so much flexibility in our qualifications in terms of picking elective units that people can have the same qualification, but in fact have a completely different skill set. So in the vast majority of situations, trainers and assessors are going to hold the units of competency that they deliver or assess. But when this is not the case, our standards actually enable you to prove equivalence to it. So when you say someone holds equivalent competencies, you are assuring that they have all the knowledge and skill and depth of experience as if they actually held the unit of competency. So that determination of equivalence is the responsibility of the employing RTO, and it's subject to audit. So equivalence only holds value within the organisation that it's granted in. It's not transferable. if a trainer and assessor then goes to work for a different RTO. Now, depending upon the industry that you work in, sometimes training packages, qualifications change very quickly. Sometimes they change more slowly. So for some organisations, John, as you have mentioned there, for some organisations, the vast majority of people don't hold the units of competency they deliver in. They will hold some version of them, and then you are going through a process to prove equivalence. Most often, that process is documented in your trainer matrices or your TACM documents if you happen to be working in a TAFE. Now, industry currency, of course, fits hand in hand with vocational competence, because this is making sure that you are up to date with how industry operates today. So trainers and assessors really have to understand how the competency that they're delivering and assessing connects with other competencies that the learner might hold to produce industry outcomes, how that competency relates to the co-workers that they work with so that they're an effective workplace team, and how that competency relates to and meets the needs of clients in the workplace. So this is a very broad understanding across the many different applications that a competency might have in many different workplaces. So it tends to not simply be based on personal experience of the trainer assessor. It needs to be kept up to date by this continuing engagement with industry. Having current industry skills means that the trainers and assessors are really able to enrich the learning experience so that learners have this real feel of the workplace. So when they walk into that workplace, they're ready to go. So it's about making sure that workplace context is right, reliable inferences are made about workplace readiness for the trainers and assessors. Now, when we look at industry engagement, so I'm just looking at a couple of the comments there, Lindsay, your comment. When we talk about industry engagement, we don't talk about employer engagement, we talk about industry engagement. So sometimes you will find workplaces where, things are done a little differently to what might normally be accepted in industry. If you only do employer engagement, that's the only experience you have. And that's why we encourage industry engagement, where you look broadly across how those skills and that knowledge is used in industry. And not surprisingly, we have another fact sheet about industry engagement. Mel might be able to pop that in the chat box for you. Now, while we are talking about industry, this is another part of the standards that has changed a little bit. So industry experts really provide such a valuable insight into the current practices in the workplace, and they will often have really specialised knowledge and skills in new and emerging industries that are going to benefit the learner. The standards actually now enable industry experts to be involved in delivery and assessment. Now, we have always had the capacity to have industry experts engaged in engaged in assessment as part of a team, and now we are expanding that to say they can be involved in training as part of the team as well. So industry experts can be involved in training, delivery and/or assessment judgments, working alongside the trainer and assessor to conduct the training and/or assessment. So when RTOs are using this arrangement, what they're doing is they're creating a training and/or assessment team who collectively meet all of the requirements from 113 to 116. So to ensure that quality and integrity of the training, RTOs are going to need to ensure that the industry experts actually do have that specialised subject matter expertise that they're looking for. They have the relevant vocational competence. They have current industry skills that are directly related to what's being delivered in the unit. So as I mentioned, industry experts have always been able to work alongside the trainer assessor for assessment purposes. So they might have given feedback, or they might have been making observations that the trainer and assessor then uses as part of the assessment process. These early changes are simply expanding that role to help them, or to enable them to actually help the trainer and assessor deliver training. Although the early changes do broaden the use of industry experts, they also put some parameters in place to maintain the quality of the training and assessment. So the definition of industry expert has actually been introduced to clarify those obligations for the RTO. And the RTO will need to actually make sure that those industry experts have specialised industry or subject matter expertise that need to be used for the training. When you do engage an industry expert to be involved in delivery or assessment, then you have to make sure that they work together with a qualified trainer and assessor for the delivery of the training and assessment. And of course, you know, as the RTO, you are always responsible for making that decision. So when we look at a couple of those terms, I just want to stress, and there's a couple of questions in there around that. What does an industry expert mean, and what does working alongside a trainer and assessor mean? When you are talking about an industry expert, that's an individual who's got the relevant specialised industry or subject matter expertise, who's engaged by the RTO on the basis of that expertise. Industry experts must have relevant vocational competencies and current industry skills directly relevant to the training and assessment being provided. Industry experts can be involved in training and assessment, but only qualified assessors are able to make an assessment judgment and determine that an individual learner is in fact competent. When we're talking about working alongside, so we're saying you can bring this person in and they can work alongside a trainer and assessor, it means that that person assists the fully qualified trainers and assessors to deliver the training and or the assessment. So this language is consistent with the previous versions of our standards, which allowed the industry expert to be involved in assessment working alongside the training and assessment. So there are some changes there, and I'm just going to answer one of those questions. Sharon, hello. Clarify that industry expert will need to, but not TAE credential. So in exactly the same way as we've done before, when we're talking about, you know, someone who is training and assessing, in particular, we've talked about assessing before. We've said all of that, vocational competence, industry currency, TAE, can be vested in one person or it can be vested in a team. We're saying the same thing here. So across the team, you have to have all of those things. If it's training, it's vocational competence, industry currency, trainer assessor qualification, PD, across the team, led by the qualified trainer and assessor. If it's assessment, it's vocational competency, industry currency, training and assessment qualification, PD, across the team, led by the qualified trainer and assessor. And of course, the qualified trainer and assessor is the only person who can make that assessment judgment at the end. So I just want to stress again, it's an expansion of what we already do. So the same things that you would have done in the past to have an industry expert involved in your assessment team, you will now do those things, or could do those things, if you chose to have an industry expert involved in training. So if we are looking at what kind of evidence we might provide for an audit in this situation, typically we're looking for verified copies of the trainers and assessors' credentials. Of course, this is the industry credentials this time. So that could be the credential, could be USI transcript. If we have to establish somebody's equivalence, then it's that process that you have gone through as an RTO to establish equivalence, and probably 99.9% of RTOs have some kind of matrix where the trainer assessor actually writes down what they think their equivalent evidence is, and then the RTO verifies that. When it comes to looking at currency, then we're looking at what kinds of activities you've got planned to maintain currency, and of course your industry engagement will contribute to that in terms of identifying what areas you might need your trainers and assessors to focus on bringing up to date. So there could be things like maybe industry certificates they've done, logs around time that they've spent in the workplace. It could be all kinds of things that sit there. When we're talking about currency, of course, the dates that those things happen are important. So please make sure that when you're looking at evidence around currency, you tell us when those things actually happened. Okay, so we talk very quickly about third-party arrangements. So, third-party arrangements are in our sector when we are looking at what the obligations are for third-party arrangements that involve training and assessment. Then are there any different things that you have to do as an RTO in terms of those clauses we've talked about? And the answer is no. Exactly the same requirements apply to trainers and assessors who are working for you under third-party arrangements. Where there are differences are around standard 2, and in particular 2.3 and 2.4. And when you look at those clauses are around the things that you will do as an RTO to manage your third-party agreement. So the requirements for the trainers and assessors are the same. If you are using a third-party arrangement, you do have some extra requirements that you would put in place to manage the third-party agreement. And this next slide shows us what kind of evidence we might in fact be looking for to demonstrate that you are doing that. So in this case, you're going to have a written agreement for the third-party agreement, for that third-party arrangement, and the sections will specify the requirements for trainers and assessors. So this might be things like how you're actually going to select the trainers and assessors, how they're going to be onboarded, how you're going to check that they're meeting those regulatory requirements, what kind of records are you going to keep about the trainers and assessors, and how you're going to actually monitor that this ongoing development happens and the agreement is working. So it's really important for you to manage a third-party agreement. Everything that third party does for you in terms of training and assessment is your responsibility as the RTO. So there has been a whole pile of information that has come at you today around these changes, and I think it'd be almost impossible for everyone to remember everything. So we have got some resources and some references for you that you can go back to and have another look at some more detailed information around these things. So, of course, you have the Standards for Registered Training Organisations and the amendment, and you can get that off the federal government's legislative website. You have our fact sheets that sit around the trainer and assessor regulatory requirements and vocational competency and industry currency, and you have the TAC Users Guide. For those of you who are registered with Assessor and the VRQA, of course, they will also have resources on their website that you should refer to, as those organisations are your regulator. All of these can be accessed from the TAC website, and you can see the address for the TAC website there. And that leaves us to say thank you so much for coming today. We have some information, some contact information on the slide there for you, how you can contact TAC and provide any feedback. And we also have some information there about our PD calendar, which has got anything on there in terms of upcoming professional development you might choose to attend. And TAC also has a whole lot of other professional development resources that are available, including our podcasts, and of course recordings of all of these sessions are also available to you. We would love your feedback. There's a link there for you to provide feedback. There is a lot of change coming in our sector. Keep your ear to the ground. Thank you for listening today, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your Monday.